I guess we're live, guys. Welcome back, everybody. My name is Manfred. I'm the CEO of Abstract, and you're watching Abstract Live. We've got a very interesting show planned for you today. I think it's going to be very quirky and very different from the things you would expect to see in an application like InstaMAT. Basically, one thing I want to do is build on the last material. You might remember it from the previous stream where we were building a material where you had skulls scattered on a soil, but we didn't use physics-based scattering. Instead, we directly dropped them on the mesh. So what I want to do in this stream is show you guys how you could actually physically scatter those meshes so they are bouncing around and rolling around and then they settle on their final position. This is a really powerful tool and you can build some very interesting things with it. Maybe I'll be able to show you a bit more. I'll try to keep the stream short today because last time we went overtime again, so this time I'll have to be a bit more mindful when it comes to the time. All right, so let's hop right into it. There's actually a lot of questions around if we're going to do a November, and yes, we're going to do a November this year as we did last year. We forgot to announce it on Discord, but we did announce it on our website. So if you go to our website right here, you'll find this Unleash Your Creativity this November with InstaMAT post, where we go in depth into the details about when it starts, when it ends, and how you can submit your materials. And I recommend you guys to submit your materials. The hoodie that I'm wearing right now, we often get questions on YouTube and in comments how you can buy one of these hoodies. And right now you cannot buy these hoodies. They're exclusive to the InstaMAT and Abstract team here. But as you guys can see, if you look at prices, there's an Abstract merchandise pack that you guys can win if you submit and you're one of the winners. And there's some awesome stuff that's part of the Abstract merch, the swag bag, like these stickers right here for RSX, or the Abstract stickers. But there's way more. Like, I love these bottles. We've been producing them, I don't know, since 2019 or so. So they've been around for a while, but people love them. They come in black and white, and they have our brand engraved on it. I really like those, and they're double insulated, so they keep your stuff warm and cold. But you'll also get one of these really cool looking t-shirts here with all of our logos and icons plastered all over the t-shirt with this beautiful stitched vertical Abstract logo. But even more so, you guys can also get hoodies. And actually there's something more here, guys. Not just hoodies and t-shirts, stickers and bottles. You'll be able to get these exclusive socks. These are the same socks that I'm wearing. I'm wearing no other socks than the official Abstract socks. If you catch me on the street, 100% I'm gonna be wearing one of these. It's either these with the brand pattern on it, or it's gonna be actually these without. So they come in two different styles. It's actually three. There's also white ones, I believe. But if you catch me rolling, I'm gonna be, if the cops ever arrest me, this is gonna be what I'm wearing on my mugshot. But also, of course, our beautiful hoodies. I'm not gonna open this one, but this is a really cool looking hoodie. It has this red gradient from gray to red, and it also has this Abstract vertical logo here stitched on. And also we have a black version with the colorful pattern, and also the one that I'm wearing, which is the white one. Guys, make sure this is exclusive. You cannot buy it, and you have to sign an agreement that you're not going to resell those. They're illegal to be sold on eBay, so you can only get them as part of this November, at least for the moment. All right. So then moving on from November, don't forget to participate. And by the way, also don't forget to like, subscribe and hit the notification bell. This stuff is really important for us. And then going back to the desktop, Mr. Producer, Inspiration Tuts is a great channel. These guys released a new video a few days ago, and it's about the best texturing software in 2025. And obviously, InstaMAT has to be mentioned, so he did a nice segment on InstaMAT as well. So
on the other hand, InstaMAT is
same for this channel. Make sure to subscribe and like and hit the notification bell for Inspiration Tuts. It's a great channel. They recently published another nice video about InstaMAT, about how you can build scalable projects, how you can build some unique stuff with InstaMAT that saves you a lot of time, things that you cannot do in other applications. And they did another follow-up video here where we are part of again. So this is really phenomenal. Thank you guys. We love you. We love you. Wait, this is wrong. How do you? I don't know. I don't know how you do. This is how you do the hard. All right, guys, this is the hard. We love you, Inspiration Tuts.
One of InstaMAT's biggest strengths
and then let's see what's next.
Non-destructive workflow. It uses something called element graph.
I would say that we go right into InstaMAT. I don't know how long this is going to take, so let's close out the Chrome browser here, and here is InstaMAT. And currently I'm in an element graph. As you guys know, the element graph is basically where we would be building procedural materials. So if I want to build a material like I did last time, I would be able to just spawn something like a Perlin noise, and then I could convert my Perlin noise to a normal map, and then I could view that on my cube. So that's where you would be able to build your materials. But what's really beautiful about InstaMAT is that it's the same graph where you can do procedural modeling, work with point clouds, and many more things. And that's what we're going to do today. So the objective for today is we want to learn how to build or how to use the physics scatter nodes to build some interesting stuff. And if you've seen the thumbnail that our team created, it's about scattering some different shapes. So I think let's start here. Let's start with scattering some basic shapes before we try to scatter our or physically simulate the scatter of our skulls. Okie dokie. So we have the cube open, there's no node, and we would, when we use a node like the physics simulate rigid body and we look at the inputs, what it wants to have is a point cloud. So in order to scatter things, we need to tell the node where it should spawn the object in the scene that's going to be simulated. And to do that, it's going to use the point cloud. So the point cloud, each point in the point cloud is basically a position where we want to simulate or spawn some object. Okay, so we can't use this as is, but we can use a shape generator for our point clouds. And so if I search for a point cloud shape generator, and that's the beautiful thing about InstaMAT, right? Like we have these shape generators for a lot of different object types. So if I search for the shape generator, you'll find we have that for the mesh, for 2D, for images, but also for the point cloud. So let's get started with the shape generator right here for the point cloud. And if I double click this, you can see that we can actually preview points in the InstaMAT viewport here. And there's also a nice feature. Let me bring that to the center. If I go to my viewport settings, you can actually control how big those points are. Maybe sometimes it's difficult to see them, and then you can just go to the scene point scale. If you ever wondered why you have that slider, it's for this, which allows you to make the points bigger or smaller. I probably should make them a bit bigger so it's easier to see them on the stream. What do you think, Mr. Producer?
Yeah, I think it's quite a good idea to make them bigger. They were quite small, you could see them, but I think this is better now.
All right, then let's keep them like this. And then going back to the canvas. And by the way, guys, if you're new to InstaMAT, the way that I'm always switching between what's here on the center stage is by using these buttons up here. So if I click here, I can go back to the element graph, to the center, and the viewport is now on the left side again. But if I want to bring the viewport to the center, I can just click here and they're changing places. It's a pretty awesome feature. Okay, so you see here's the point cloud that we're generating, but what you can see is that if I fly into the point cloud is that we only build points on the surface of our icosahedron. But if I want to create points in the volume, we can use another node, and it's point cloud volume generator here. So this guy. And you can see that this guy actually spawns points inside of the volume. And what I want to do is I want to create something like a stack. So imagine we have a cone, and the cone is filled with different objects, and then we let that drop to the ground, and it should build a natural stack of objects where there's a lot of different rotations and everything is fully plausible. So to do this, I can just use the cone shape here, and you can see this builds our points already in the shape of a cone. Now imagine if you would start dropping those down to the ground. This should build a nice pile of whatever we want to scatter here. And then we can control the height and the radius of our cone, and we can also choose how many points we want to have in that volume. Let's say we spawn, how many points should we spawn here? Maybe spawn precisely 200. Okay. So we have our points. And I think this should be sitting on the grid center. Let's enable the scene grid so we can understand how this is located. So I'm searching for show grid. So enabling show grid allows me to see where our coordinate system 0 is. So you see the plane is actually, it cuts through our volume, and that's not too great. So to fix that, we can use a node. And if you ever use the mesh nodes in InstaMAT, you'll feel right at home when you work with the point cloud nodes, because you also have nodes like point cloud transform. And point cloud transform allows you to transform a point cloud. So you can move it around, you can scale it, you can rotate it. So I can just move it so it's above ground. So when we simulate it and we simulate it against the ground plane, it would just drop onto the ground plane like this. Okay. So we have our point cloud, and then we can simulate these points by just plugging it into our physics simulate rigid body node like this. And there's a couple of settings here. Like you can control the mass of the rigid bodies, you can control how many meshes you simulate here and the shape of it. But we will just start with a box. We will change this as we go on, but first we want to simulate a couple of boxes falling to the ground. Okay, and if I double click this node or I click on the pin, you can see what happens. Our point cloud changed quite a bit. So first it thinned out the point cloud a little bit because it's removing self-collision. So when you start the simulation and you have a couple of points that are intersecting, it automatically cleans those up so it's not looking bad. But if you look at this, it's already on the ground, right? Some simulation happened here. And this is basically, if you look at the iterations count, that determines how many simulation steps we're doing, like how long the timeline of our simulation is. And then we have 20 steps, and you can look at the time step value here. And time step determines how many milliseconds pass between each of those simulation steps. So if your time step is too high, you might get an inaccurate simulation. If it's too low, you need to do a lot of iterations, which will make the whole node run a bit slower. But the nice thing is you can actually play this back if you go to 1, and then you could drag the slider and you can see what happens. Right, so you see what happens is that a couple of those points are falling through the ground plane, and that is because the velocity is too high when we simulate this and they just fall through. And that might not be a problem if you, or actually to fix it, I think we could reduce the time step. I'll show you 2 ways how to fix that. Yeah. So you see now the time step is so low that we actually simulate each step, because what happened is in the simulation, when we go from step 3 to step 4 and we advance by 50 milliseconds, the whole thing is already at the next position, and the physics solver doesn't notice the collision with the ground plane that it should have collided with. Makes sense. Once again, we simulate from step 3 to step 4. We simulate 50 milliseconds passing between those steps. And there's a ground plane in between this position and this position, but it just moves down here so it doesn't recognize the collision. So to fix this, you can lower the time step as I did it here. That's one way to fix it. But then you have to do way more simulations to arrive at something like if you would use 50 milliseconds. So let's reset it here and let's go back to 50 milliseconds. And then if we simulate this, you can see how those guys are just falling through the ground right here. And to fix this, there's another way that you can use, and that's called continuous collision. So if we use continuous collision here, what it does is when it moves from step 3 to step 4, it doesn't just move the position of the body, it actually tries to raycast or sweep between step 3 and 4, and then it will recognize if there's a collision that it would have missed as part of the time step. So with the continuous collision enabled, and if I simulate the steps here, you see we have way less of those guys falling through. And that's what the continuous collision enables us to do. So I can just reduce the time step a little bit, and with the continuous collision we no longer have any rigid body falling through the ground. Great. So that's our pile of points. Alright guys, so we have our points simulated, and you see they're bouncing around if we move the slider here. And you can control how the collision response looks like by modifying mass and the static friction. So if you don't want them to slide around, you should probably increase the static and kinematic friction, and then they won't roll around. They'll settle really fast. Okie dokie, so let's simulate a few steps, and once they're settled, I think we have enough steps, maybe right here. We don't have to have them all tumble all the way to until they're still. And then the question is, like, how do you turn this into a mesh? And to turn this into a mesh, you have a point cloud here's output. You can just use the mesh spawn on point cloud. And the point cloud you get from the physics sim is actually not just positions. There's some scale values, rotation values. So once we spawn meshes here, it should look perfectly fine. And what we want to spawn here is a mesh. And if we go back to our simulate, we use a box here as our input shape with a scale of 1. So what we want to plug in here is a mesh primitive that has exactly that same size. So we can use the mesh shape generator, which if I go to box is already set to 1. So we can use this guy and just set it to the append mesh, I think, like this. And if I double click, you can see now we have our stack of boxes, which is pretty nice. It's very easy to do this. So if we go back to the physics sim, so now I'm previewing the mesh and I can still adjust and I can see exactly how the simulation behaves here. Let's reset the friction here so we have a bit more outliers. You see with the friction now we have more of the cubes at the outskirts, which may or may not be great. It depends what kind of a stack you want to build, but let's assume I want to build a stack where we don't have any outliers. So what I can do to achieve this, I can use a node that removes points based on a volume. It's similar to if you do asset texturing. You might remember the mesh mask volume node, where you get a volume mask that you can move around and everything inside of the volume will then get the color from the layer that you assign it to. And to do the similar thing here, and that's so beautiful about InstaMAT, is how consistent everything is. Here we can use the point cloud cull volume. You could also call it mask volume actually, which might be maybe we should rename it to mask volume, then it's even more consistent. But let's just insert it here. And then you can see I get this primitive. And if I move this guy around, it'll remove the boxes that are outside of the volume, and we can choose to use a sphere. And then I can use W, E, and R to move my volume around, and I can mask it so we don't have any of the outliers here basically. So let's preview it like this. You can see this is these are the points again, and I can move my volume mask around to do the culling or the masking. I think at this point we can probably disable the ground plane. So let me go back to the viewport settings, and then here I'll disable show grid. But by the way, guys, you can also control the grid colors, and I think we can also control the opacity of our grid lines. Yes, you see we can even control the grid lines here, but I just want to disable it completely for the moment. And I want to actually see the result here with the cube. So we don't have any outliers. We don't have... everything is on the plane, not below. But what if you want to see the plane here actually? To see the plane, we can just create another mesh primitive. So I'm going to use the mesh shape generator once again. And by the way, guys, you can also load in your own FBXs. You don't have to use the mesh primitives, the mesh shape generator. But in this case, it's easier. And what I want to generate here is a plane. And the plane should have a size of maybe 10 by 10. And then I'll plug it into the mesh. So whatever we plug into the mesh up here will become the input, and that's why we call the meshes that we have simulated append mesh, and this allows you to concatenate different meshes very easily. So we have a plane. The plane is probably too big. Let's make the plane a bit smaller, maybe 5 by 5, or even smaller, 3 by 3, or even smaller, 2 by 2. Yeah, I think that's great. All right, so here's our simulated stack of boxes. But what if you want to simulate another round of primitives? Say we want to have some spheres that we want to simulate on top of this stack, so we could create like a layered stack. To do this, we can now we can use the same volume again, the same point cloud. So I'll branch off here from the point cloud transform, and then I'll move that over here. And I want to move it a bit up, I think, because right now it was most likely on the same position as the stack. So here we can see, that's one of the interesting things, right? If you select a node, you will see the gizmo of the node. But if you didn't change what you're actually previewing in the viewport, this allows you to actually compare how things work in relation to each other. So I see that my cone that generates the points is actually located on my stack, and that's not great because I want to drop it from the top. So I can just move the point cloud transform a bit up so it actually starts above the stack and not on the stack. And then we can use the simulate node again. So I'll just clone this guy right here because I have continuous collision enabled on this one. So what we're going to do is we're going to plug that in here, and then as a simulation primitive, we can just use a sphere. And it's better to use the sphere here because it's an analytical sphere, so you don't need to simulate a tessellated mesh, which might have some edges, or it's not super tessellated, so the simulation wouldn't be so nice. So I'm simulating the sphere here. And then if we would then use again the mesh spawn on point cloud to see what we're actually doing here, and I'll disable all of these nodes, and then I use the mesh shape generator again, and I'll plug the sphere into my append mesh. You can see that we have a lot of spheres, and I guess they rolled around too far. That's my assumption here. No, actually they hit the ground plane, right? They don't simulate against anything, if you think about it. Like the same thing would happen. They would hit the ground plane and then they would just roll away. This is exactly what we're seeing here, right? We don't simulate against the stack yet. We dropped the cone, all of the points, and then they just roll forever. But what we want to do actually is we want to not simulate against the ground plane as it's set up here by default. What we want to do here is we want to simulate against the mesh. And it's also pretty interesting, by the way, guys, if you have a height map because you do some texturing and there's a specific slope you want to simulate on, you can use a height map as input. But what we want to do is use a mesh as input. And then we can plug in our previously created mesh into the ground mesh. And then we're simulating our physics scatter on against the mesh that we're plugging in here. And you can see that if we start again from the beginning of our simulation, you see that now there is some collision and then things start to fall off. We don't see the rest of the simulation yet because when we call mesh spawn on point cloud, we only plug in the append mesh. So we need to do the same thing that we did previously, where we took the ground plane and used that as the basis, and then we added our shapes that we simulated on top. So in this case, what we want to do is we want to plug in the output of the previous spawn on point cloud into the new one as input, and then you guys can see here we can see exactly perfectly see how we simulate the balls and how they correlate to the rest of the scene. So let's take a look at this. See, the balls are coming down and they're falling off the ground plane. Which is actually not bad because the outliers are automatically masked off. But I think if we increase the friction, they should probably not roll so far. Well, it's spheres, they still want to roll. Do I have to disable it? No, I think if we disable the friction, there's no friction. Maybe we have to set it to a higher value. Let's see what happens if we set it to 5. They're still rolling. The nature of spheres. Yeah, we just keep them rolling. Oh, what else do we have? Actually, do we have a different primitive? There's a cone. Let's use a cone. And then we can change our shape generator to be a cone as well. So now we have cones. Well, those cones can also roll around, actually. It's what they're doing. Yeah, but let's keep the cones.
I have to say that I really love how fast it computes. I mean, you can just work on that and basically in real time, so that's really awesome.
Absolutely. I mean, and the beauty is really also the non-destructive workflow, right? Unlike other simulations where it's very difficult to go back and forth and see the changes as a result of a different simulation. Here, everything stacks together. So if I would, in the previous simulation, change some parameter, like I'm modifying the time step, you see the following cone simulation is completely impacted by that. But actually, let's go back to the spheres. And then here on the sim. Actually, that's wrong. I changed the box to a sphere, so I have to change this back to a box. And then this is our sphere here. That's why you should always use comments, guys. I mentioned this in the last stream already. Just whenever you're doing something, you could just select all of this block here, and then you can write simulate boxes, and then it's very easy to understand when you simulate the boxes. And if you want to make it more obvious that these are boxes, you can assign a specific color. For instance, if my boxes if I see that I'm inside of the light reddish brown rectangle, I know it's the boxes, and then here I can say this is the part where we simulate the spheres. Right, I locked this. Let's unlock this. Nope, it's not this. To unlock a comment, we have to click here. Now I have unlocked my comment and I can move it around. All right. And maybe you're wondering, how can we assign different materials? Like, what if I want to have the boxes being blue and the spheres being some metallic color? This is actually very easy to do if you want to do that for the viewport. So what you can do is, so remember here, this shape generator creates our box because we're in the light red area here. And then you can use a node called assign material. So I assign a material. And then I assign a material that's called box, and a key part is to assign it to the entire mesh, yes, and then also allow the material to be created on the mesh if it doesn't exist. And then I'll take the same node, I'll drag it to duplicate, assign it here, and then we call this our plane. Assign it here. And once more, I'll just drag it for the sphere. But keep in mind, these are just like the material IDs. Like if you would be working in Maya or Blender where you just assign material IDs, this doesn't necessarily have to be, it doesn't contain the material definitions. It just means this mesh would want to use a material that has the name circle, for instance. You would still need to create the material circle. And you can do that using the viewport material assign viewport node. So this node basically instructs InstaMAT to assign this material if you find a mesh that has a specific material ID, specifically for the viewport. So if I call this, what did we call the ground plane? Yes. And we have displacement enabled, which is why this is just completely in a different location. So let me disable this. So here for the viewport now knows if it encounters a mesh with the name plane, a material with the name plane, this is how we're going to treat it. And then we can assign a color, for instance, for the ground plane. Probably makes sense to desaturate it with a higher roughness. And then we can just copy this. And we want our boxes to be blue. So I'll just reset this. Actually, this should have been box. And now we need to update this node. Right, there was a conflict because both materials were called plane now, so it overrode the other definition. So this is box, and then we duplicate this, and this is going to be the, did I call it circle actually? It's a sphere. Yeah, but it does work. There you go. Here you can see our stack, and we have different material IDs. And yeah, let's use the cull volume again here, because we have some outliers and we can remove those if we use our culling feature. So we just keep the ones that are on the stack. It's much nicer. Yeah, so that's how you can simulate a stack like this. And by the way, guys, if you want to export this, you can just expose in the same way that you would expose a material output for a PBR material you're creating. You can expose a mesh output and then call that, for instance, mesh. Very, very basic. But this is an output now that if I would go to my export window, you can see there's now, it recognizes that you have a data output. And if I enable the switch and export, it's going to export my mesh as an FBX as we instructed it above. And then if I go to my export folder, I have a shortcut here. You can see I have an FBX file here. And just to verify that this actually works, we can open up Studio, Instalot Studio, drag the mesh in, and you can see here's our stack. And we have all of the individual objects here in our scene, which allows us to continue working on loading this into another application. And if you want to export your mesh with material definitions, this is a different way of working. What you would want to do is you would use one of those scene nodes. So the scene nodes allow you to create a full scene graph where you can add all of your objects into the scene graph and then also set up the material definitions in the scene graph as well. And if you would export it, all of the textures, all of the meshes would be embedded into a single FBX, and when you load it into your rendering application, everything would just work. So if that's what you want to do, make sure to investigate, explore like a curious adventurer. The C nodes, they won't harm you. They won't bite, but they're pretty powerful. Okay, so this is working. Is there anything else we should do, Daniel?
I don't know. Maybe we could also show we could just UV unwrap those or even optimize. So this would be a workflow as well that's possible.
Yes, that's a workflow that's possible, but it might be more interesting than to show something that's different from optimization, because I think we showed mesh optimization. Give me a second. So let's assume that we're creating smaller spheres. So I can actually, in the scatter node, I can change the scale of the spheres that I'm simulating. So if I set that to a value of 0.5, you can see that now you have a lot of those smaller spheres. And let's see what happens if we set that even smaller. And what's pretty cool is that the scale value is part of the point cloud as well. So as you saw, I didn't change the size of my shape generator, because the spawn on point cloud takes care of adjusting the scale so it matches the scale of your physics simulation. So that's a bit too small. Let's set it back to 0.5. Oh, I duplicated the node. Shouldn't have done that. Would be good to have a bit more of those. Yeah, if you just want to get more points, what you can do easily is you can spawn the append point cloud node, and you just append the point cloud to the point cloud, and you just move it a little bit. So now you have twice the amount of points, and if we simulate this, we should have way more spheres. You see now we have a ton of those spheres in our scene. Okay, then we cull the volume. Let's see what happens after we cull. Right, that looks better. And then we spawn the mesh. Actually, I think we need to reduce the size of our cull here. Okay, so the reason that I changed the size of the spheres to be smaller, because you can use spheres to simulate things like water. Like you would make them really, really small, and then you would simulate a ton of them, and then you get something like a fluid simulation. But what we can do with the mesh that we're generating here is to actually turn it into something like water. And the way that this would normally work is actually using voxelization techniques, where you then voxelize your spheres into a single solid. And to do that, we can actually just remove the mesh that we're appending here, and now we just have our spheres, right? And what we can do with the spheres then is pretty interesting. So let me move all of those nodes to the side. And to simulate this, we can actually, or to implement this workflow, we can use the voxelize node. It actually does exactly what we want in this case. So if I voxelize my node and I preview this, you can see it turns everything into a single body. And we can choose the resolution of our voxelization. As you guys can see, it then creates something that looks like fluid. And it really depends. Like if you go too small, you will start seeing individual spheres. So you should have, if you want to have a high-res voxelization, you should probably have a lot of really, really tiny spheres for this to look right. But there's a way to still make it work. And one of the ways would be to smooth the result that you're getting here. And I can do that if I use mesh subdivide. And then we use Catmull Clark. Let me enable the wireframe so you guys can see the result. And then if I preview our result here of this node by double-clicking, I can set the level to 1. And then we get way more polygons on our result. And you guys can see it already becomes more smooth, right? So from this low poly voxelized look, it starts to look more smooth. But it's still not smooth enough. So what you can do is you could use a node for this, mesh smooth. So you see there's a lot of nodes already in InstaMAT when it comes to procedural modeling. So let me preview this. Let me disable the wireframe. And if I set this to 1, you can see how we start smoothing our result, and it looks less like balls, more like a liquid. So let's do the mesh smooth, but you can see the normals haven't been readjusted. What we want to do after the smooth is to recalculate our normals. Let's do that. Like this, and you see now it looks way smoother, because we actually we don't just smooth the mesh and adjust the polygons. This time we also recalculate the normals, which makes it look way more smooth. So if you go back here, if we set that to 1, you can see it already looks a bit smoother, and then you can increase that to 2 or maybe 1.5 or 0.5 if you want to have less smoothing. It really depends what kind of a liquid you want to simulate here. Okay, but now we just have that fake liquid here, right? It doesn't really make sense. I think we need more smoothing. it doesn't make a lot of sense in and by itself, but once we go back to our original previously simulated scene, and then we would use this as the and combine it with our voxelized result, we will see how that looks together. And to do this, we can simply use mesh append, and then we append those two results together, preview the result, and you can see now we have our boxes covered in this. It looks a bit like liquid metal, I would guess. And the reason that we don't have a material on it is because we didn't assign material. Because the voxelization basically kills all of the topological info you have, because it creates a new mesh from scratch based on the input. We would have to do a mesh assign material here, and then we can again allow the creation, the entire mesh, and we call it, I think we used circle. And there you go. Now you have your liquid colored. So let's enable this to be metal, lower the roughness. Also here for the boxes, maybe lower the roughness. And actually that's wrong. Like this. Some liquid gold over our boxes. Looks pretty cool. And then keep in mind that we can always tweak this. Like I can always go back and adjust the smoothness of our voxelization. Make it smoother, make it less smooth. Or change the resolution of our voxelization. What happens if I set it to 45? Or maybe even 35? Like this. It looks pretty cool. And again, this is actually fully interactive still. Even though we do all of these heavy operations, I can go back to the simulation node here, and then if I play back the time, you can see that the whole result changes pretty fast, and you can see how all of that big slime blob, actually that looks so cool. Jesus, that's awesome. You can actually see how the whole thing slams onto the boxes and then starts gooing apart. That's so cool. Yeah.
Yeah, and we could even render a video out of this, which is quite awesome.
Exactly, but that's probably out of scope for this video, right? But that's an interesting teaser, guys. You can actually render videos from your viewport. It's very easy to do this. Just play around. Maybe you'll figure out how it works here in the dope sheet. Did we create a tutorial for this? Maybe you know?
I'm not sure, actually. I don't think we have one.
Yeah, would be nice to actually show people how to do a turntable of the material, because you actually don't have to use other tools to do this. You can render a turntable in InstaMAT without having to export, reload, and then build it in other materials and then in tools, and then you do a change and you have to re-export, reload. You can do that all in InstaMAT. It's pretty awesome. Yeah, so here's our goo. And then let's see, do we want to do a bit more iteration steps here? It looks pretty cool. Maybe don't use gold. Let's make it some metal. Yeah, so keep in mind, guys, you can do this because you want to render a specific scene. And then you export your mesh and you reload it in Maya or Blender. Or you can use this for your material creation workflows. Or you could use this to build a game asset, right? Imagine you would have to simulate or create exactly this. Like, imagine you would have to create like a cereal bowl with a couple of things inside of it. You can easily do that in InstaMAT. You just simulate a lot of cornflakes, drop them into your bowl, and then you drop a lot of small spheres to simulate the liquid, and then you just export it, optimize it like Daniel said, to reduce the poly count. But let's export the final result here actually as mesh again. Not this. To export it as output. Then we can call this our physics sim demo live stream 5th November 2025. So we'll make sure that we'll put it on Polyverse for you guys to download if you want to inspect the individual steps that I've taken here in this particular workflow. So let me save it here. And then I want to go back to our skulls and see how we can use the same workflow when it comes to building the material, a material in InstaMAT. And remember last time, I'll load it right up. Last time we've built this really nice looking skull and bone material where we have scattered a couple of skulls on a plane. It was this material right here, which ended up looking like this. That you can see we have all of these skulls, but you see they're all individual, that they don't really interact with each other. They don't build stacks. Let me enable the displacement here. You can see we have those skulls. It looks pretty cool. And what we want to do now is maybe use physics simulation instead of just manually scattering those shapes. So let me go back to this and see how it was built. It's so long ago, I don't remember. Right. So here we do the scatter. We have our skull and we scatter different meshes, but the difference once again to this versus the physics node is that this right here is just placing it, dropping it on the mesh, and it doesn't take into account velocity of objects, interaction between two objects that collide. It's very fast and it's very good for a lot of workflows, and as you guys can see, this clearly builds a really nice looking result. But if you want to create more complex scatters, you'll have to use the physics-based node. So I'll just move this to the side. And then we basically have to do the same thing we did in the previous segment of this show, where we used the point cloud volume generator to produce the basic volume for our points. And I'm doing this here as well. We want to simulate a cone, and then we use, let's say, 200 points. And if I double click this, I can see my points right here. So we want, for each of these points, we want to drop a skull, and this should hopefully arrange itself similar to this, but nicely situated on the ground. And then we can use our rigid body simulation here to simulate our points for us. And if we look at this, you see we had the same issue here again. The time step is too big, and what we want to do is enable continuous collision and maybe reduce the time step a little bit. Right. Remember, guys, the ground plane intersects the base plane, so we have to move our shape generator up a bit, right? Because the plane is at the half height of the cone, so half of the shapes fall below the ground plane and never intersect with it. So we do our point cloud transform here, and then we just move this up so it's above the ground plane. And then if we simulate our shapes, you see now it nicely hits the ground. All right, so how do we get the skulls in here, right? Instead of simulating just a primitive like a box or a sphere or one of these guys, we want to simulate a mesh. And to do this, we can simply grab our skull up here. Remember, this is the mesh. This guy, I can render it in the graph for you. So this is our skull mesh that we're scattering around here. And to use that for the simulation, I'll just move the node down here. And I know I want to plug it into the simulate node, but you can just plug it in. But what's a bit better is if you first maybe decimate it down, right? For the physics simulation, we don't need to simulate the skull at 12,000 polygons. That'll make it much slower. And you can use the optimize node, which is basically InstaMAT integrated into InstaMAT, that allows us to reduce the amount of polygons without really destroying the shape overall. So I'll set that to 0.1% triangles, which means we remove 90% or we keep 10% of the initial poly count. And if we render this, let's make sure that it still looks good. There you go, this looks perfect. Still very great, only a fraction of the polygons. And then in order to plug it in and have it be very efficient, we can create a convex hull from this. There you go, the convex hull, which is just the outer volume, right? There's no concave shape to it. So it's just a convex object. And if you render it, you'll see exactly how it looks. You see, we removed all the concave parts. It's just a single body. So this is perfect for simulation. And that's what I want to plug into my simulate node. So moving these guys back here. Let's create a comment. Optimize skull for physics sim. Like this. And then here, all we have to do is we want to, for our input shape number 1, we want to simulate a mesh. And then I'll just plug in my skull. And it should do our simulation. And if we preview our point cloud, we don't really see a lot, right? Because it's still just points, but these points should now be distributed in a way that it makes sense when you would simulate the skull. So this should be okay to use then, and use the spawn node to spawn the skull. All right, spawn on point cloud right here. And then all we have to do is we take our skull. I'll use the high poly skull here, and then I'll just plug that into the append mesh, and then hopefully this simulated a couple of skulls. It's way too big. So if it looks like this, you most likely have to disable displacement. And I think we have I think I killed the GPU. Oh no, I hope we have an autosave. So the reason is we had way too many polygons. I had tessellation enabled and my GPU just didn't like it. So let's see if we can bring that back. Let's open InstaMAT. Yeah, that's the tricky part. If you're dealing with a lot of polygons, make sure you disable tessellation. Normally InstaMAT would tell you, hey, that's great. Thankfully we have an autosave package. Let's see if it's recent. So if you're working with meshes, this is perfectly recent. Thank you, InstaMAT. So I'll save that right here. It actually saved the state right before I previewed. And it's so smart. Fantastic. I'll save that. Yeah, so what happened is that I had tessellation enabled. Probably too high, too many polygons. Yeah, 30. The tessellation level is set to 30, and then we have displacement enabled, so that's what killed it. Probably we had way too many polygons on this. So again, I plug in my skull, reroute point here, append it, and then we have a couple of million polygons here, and you can see now it actually works. So make sure to disable tessellation. This is just a laptop, so that's the reason. So actually, let's disable the material here. So we have a lot of material outputs right on this material, the whole material basically. So we will see that on the skulls, but for the preview when working on the skulls, it doesn't make a lot of sense. So I'm just overriding the preview of what we see in the viewport, so it's a bit easier to recognize this. All right, and here we can see what we simulated. As you guys can see, this creates a very interesting looking stack of skulls. And again, we can control how many we want to simulate here by going back to our point cloud volume generator and saying maybe we just want to simulate 50 or 10. Keep in mind some of those will be removed. So we spawn 10 points, but some are so close to each other that the physics simulation before it begins has to remove some, because otherwise 2 objects would be interlocked. All right, maybe a bit more, 50 or much more, 500. Wow, that's an insane stack of skulls. Yeah, let's use this. And by the way, you can also control some variance parameters when it comes to the initial simulation. Do you want to randomly rotate the objects when you spawn them? I think that makes sense. So let's crank up all of the rotations so they completely are randomized when it comes to the scale. And then we can also control a bit of the scale variance, right? Not every scale should be the same size. Some should be smaller, some should be bigger. Maybe like this. Yeah, I mean, it really depends how many we want to have on our material, but we can always tweak it. So let's just use those guys. But I think we should thin out our scatter here a bit. So I'll use the cull volume again to make it a bit smaller. So it's more rectangular. So it works better as a material. Maybe like this. All right, so that's somewhat square. And then we can use the mesh tile node. I'll just duplicate it so I can tweak this and dial it in. Because one of the tricky parts is now you need to know how big your scatter is. And in this case, how big was it? Maybe 10 by 10? Actually much smaller, 1 by 1. I think that's pretty close. It's just 1 by 1. And we don't have a ground plane. Let me get a ground plane here. Mesh spawn, mesh shape generator. And then a plane. 2 by 2, append it in. Right, and here we can see the height output. It looks pretty nice. Why did this happen? Something is, I think it's spooky, guys. I think this is, no stream ever had so many crashes. I don't know what's going on. Maybe I should restart the computer. Maybe it's the screen sharing, but I haven't seen this. It looks like the whole app just went bonkers here. Or it's because I had the skulls previewed, which still was too many polygons. Maybe I should have removed the preview of the skulls again. But let's go back. Spooky crashes today, guys. It's the second Halloween edition. Let's reload our Skull and Bones. Hopefully we have another autosave here. Actually, we don't. That's too bad. But let's quickly repeat. All right, so I'll plug those guys in, reroute, and then I'll just absolutely speedrun this. Once again, I'll use the volume, point cloud volume cull here to reduce the size and make it a bit more square. Let me see this with the skulls. Please, oh no, did I have to disable the tessellation again? Maybe just set it to none, actually. And then double click here. We see the skulls. I think the distribution is not perfect here. Maybe move it a bit up. Scale it. Like this. And then let me, before I continue here, when I want to load it or preview the baked result, I'm going to switch back to just the bevel cube here, and then I'm going to again use the mesh tile node, plug this in here, and I think a scale of 1 might not necessarily work, does work. And then I'll spawn the shape generator, create a plane, and then I'll plug it in here, and this time I'll save. All right, so let's see what happens if I preview this. I'm not sure why this didn't work. It does work. And is it tiling? Let's switch to tiling. Yes, it looks to be perfectly tiling. We don't have a lot of intersections. I mean, here we have. And the pretty cool thing is that we can now go back to the simulation here and we can adjust this. And you guys can see exactly how the scatter comes to be. Maybe we want to have less friction here. So, well, they roll around a bit too much then, right? So let's increase the friction again. On the other hand, you know what? We do want to have some stack here, right? I think there's a bit of... Let's increase this, actually. They're probably not bouncing around too much. Softness and elasticity down. I wonder if we have to simulate 2 stacks to get this looking right. But either way, moving on from this, we can now just plug this instead of our previous output. We can just plug this as our height map into our material, and we will get our material simulated like this. So now we have those skulls physically simulated here, and there's all of them act properly. There's no weird intersections. If there's overlaps, but then they're justified based on what we're actually simulating here. And it's pretty cool how fast this is, and we can always tweak our iterations, how we simulate this, how many steps we simulate. We could, we have the continuous collision, reduce the time step, and then simulate them and see what happens. Let's reset this. Yeah, they settle pretty fast. So here they start right, and then we drop them down, and then they settle. I guess they settle pretty fast because the shape is not it has so many corners that it pretty quickly settles in an interesting into a pattern where it just works out for it. When you see they jiggle around a little bit, but for the most part, this actually looks pretty cool how it spawned this one. Okay, you know what, let's re-enable displacement. I'm not going to preview the meshes anymore, so back to tessellation, subdivision 30, and then we increase the displacement factor. And then we load the high cube here. Do we have a stack? I guess so. This one, for instance, right? This one is tilted and is like bent upright because there's other skulls in the proximity, which makes this look pretty cool. But we could also, if we want to simulate another round, actually, let's see how that looks. All right, I'll save this here. And remember what I showed you guys before, where we did 2 rounds of simulations to create 2 layers of having more objects laying on top of each other. So we can do this actually if we take the simulate node right here, and then we simulate instead of just a ground plane, we're going to use a mesh as input to simulate against. And here we're using then the output from the previous sim as a ground mesh, and then we're going to use the spawn on point cloud node here, and then we're spawning those simulated points, and we're going to append it to our previous result again. So actually this should go here, and then this should go here, and then the skull is what we've simulated, so I'll plug it in here. All right, so at this point we're at 2.5 million polygons. Let's just plug this in here. And now you see we have way more skulls. And now we have an actual, now it's way more obvious that we have a stack of different skulls, right? This is pretty cool, right? And that's the kind of thing you can do in InstaMAT very easily. I understand that the workflow that you guys saw with all of those different nodes is a bit more, it's not as intuitive as if you just work with images. But once you wrap your head around it, it becomes very, very intuitive, and you'll just understand how it works. So we have all of these skulls here, and we could have simulated other body parts actually, right? We don't have the second layer, we don't have to use the skulls. Let's actually do that. Let's use, what did we have? I remember we had something else, the scalp, which was a shoulder blade, something I learned in the last live stream, but we have the foot here. So let's take the foot, and again, we're doing our optimization pass, right? We did an optimize in the convex hull to make the simulation faster. I'll do the same for the foot. So I'll optimize the foot down to 10%. And then we'll create a convex hull. And then I want to see exactly how that simulation is going to be ran. Mesh render depth. So this is the convex hull for the foot, right? You see it's a base shape of a foot, but if you compare it to the mesh, it's super accurate, right? You see the viewport doesn't even jump. It's just the silhouette, the outer shape of the foot. And then this is what we can use when we simulate our upper layer, and then as the append mesh, when we use the spawn node right here, we'll plug this guy in, and now we scattered some feet on our material, and now there you have it. Sadly, they all rotate to the side. Would be nice to see it from the top, but it makes sense, right? They hit on a skull and then they tumble to the side as they roll off the skull. Let's go back here, and maybe we can improve the visibility a bit if we don't have a rotation. Can we make we can make them turn them into Bigfoot. Let's increase the size of the feet. There you go, the big feet. Perfect. These are way more visible. The feet. Big, gigantic, humongous feet. Maybe a bit of scale variance and rotation variance a little bit. Yeah, so we have some feet here now in our simulation. Yeah. Pretty nice material overall. Let's render this at a higher resolution. Pretty cool how you have those fine geometric details in the material from simulating the feet. And we could add more shapes to this, right? More body parts. Or even move the point cloud around, right? We kept it on the same position. Maybe we should actually do a point cloud transform and then adjust it a little bit. Actually, I just have to wing it like this. Yep. All right. All right, so here's our height map that we generated. We have the color map. We don't need it really because we didn't assign vertex colors to these feet, but we could have done that to make it more visible. It's fully tileable, and I think with that we accomplished the goal of creating multiple layers of different scatters where things interact with the previous simulation. It's fully dynamic. We can always change the meshes, we can change the shapes, we can change how much we have. We can reduce the amount of skulls we have if that's what we want to do by simply going back to our point cloud volume generator. And then we can set that to maybe just 50. Well, that looks interesting. What happened here? Why did we change this to boxes? Did I break a connection? I don't know, but this is the absolutely spooky edition, guys. Like, what happened here? Let's go back to 200. I'm not sure why they changed the boxes. Maybe they all intersect and then they all get culled? Well, that's interesting. But I can reduce the point count at least and see the result with less skulls, like this. Absolutely spooky edition, guys. This is very adventurous, but you guys at least see that this is all happening live and this is not pre-recorded, pre-scripted. This is all happening right here in the moment. It's 6 p.m. here in Germany. Yeah, but I do think we accomplished our goal, right, Daniel? I think for the most part, we learned how the scatter works, and we also saw how we can combine it into the workflow when we were creating an actual material.
Yeah, indeed. And I think in the traditional workflow, when you've done that with 2D images, it's nearly impossible to do like that. And before InstaMAT, you had to use multiple tools to just make your scatter and export your height map, import it. And then you couldn't even change it after when you don't like the results. So this is really, really powerful workflow.
Absolutely. And there's way more crazy things you can do in InstaMAT. We could build our own HDRIs. We can do some mesh booleans to actually, when we want to simulate the cornflakes, we could actually build the bowl and the cornflakes in InstaMAT using procedural modeling tools, which would have been interesting actually. Maybe that's for another show. But there's a lot of things you can build in InstaMAT that's absolutely unique that you can't do in other tools. But as you build more and more of those layers of complexity, things also get a bit more tricky to understand. But if you've ever built a complex material, you know this, right? Like at some point it becomes really difficult to understand how a specific change came to be, and just disabling one node can completely ruin your result. So that's why I always hated working on somebody else's material. And it's the same with the physics scatter. We could probably go in and then figure out why the point cloud that we scattered turned into boxes and then iteratively correct that issue. But the beauty is still in the workflow, that everything is non-destructive and you can always figure out what's going on, and you can always go back, and once you get a bad result, it's not the end of the world. You can just change the input parameters and get a completely different result that works again. Yeah, all right, guys. Don't forget to like and subscribe. Hit the notification bell. That's really important for us. That's it for today. We will be back next week on Wednesday, 5 p.m. Central European time. I have no idea what time that is in your time zone, but please make sure to check it out. Come back to our stream. We've got some great things planned for you guys. Stay tuned for the next show of Abstract Live.